A millionaire caught his maid teaching his blind daughter Braille without his permission. The new employee, defying all the rules, decided to bring light into the child's dark world through touch and Braille reading. The millionaire's reaction in that room left everyone surprised. Watch this story until the end. The Blackwood estate stood like a fortress on the coast of Newport, Rhode Island, its pristine white walls gleaming against the turbulent Atlantic. From a distance, the mansion appeared perfect, a testament to wealth, power, and architectural mastery. Yet for all its grandeur, the estate housed a different kind of storm within its walls. Maxwell Blackwood surveyed his property from the window of his study, his reflection hard and unyielding in the glass. At 45, he had built an empire that spanned from New York to Silicon Valley, transforming a modest inheritance into one of the largest investment firms on the East Coast. Everything in his life was meticulously calculated: risks, returns, relationships. Emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford, a weakness he refused to indulge. "Mr. Blackwood, your conference call is ready," his assistant announced from the doorway, her voice carefully modulated. He nodded without turning. "And Catherine?" "Miss Catherine has completed her lessons for today. Dr. Patterson reports minimal progress." Maxwell's jaw tightened. "That will be all, Charlotte." Left alone, he allowed himself one moment of vulnerability, a brief closing of his eyes, a single deep breath. 3 years had passed since the accident that took his wife and his daughter's sight. 3 years of specialists, therapies, and private tutors, with Catherine retreating further into herself with each passing month. 12 floors below, in the east wing of the mansion, 10-year-old Catherine Blackwood sat motionless by her bedroom window. Though she couldn't see the ocean beyond, she could hear it, the rhythmic crashing of waves against the cliffs, the only sound that seemed to penetrate the silence of her world. Her delicate fingers traced patterns on the windowsill, pale and thin like porcelain. The room around her was a showcase of her father's guilt, every toy, book, and piece of furniture specially selected by the best consultants money could buy. Yet Catherine rarely touched any of them. What use were beautiful things to someone who lived in darkness? "Miss Catherine?" A soft knock accompanied the voice. "It's time for your afternoon snack." Mrs. Reynolds, the head housekeeper, entered with practiced efficiency. She had worked for the Blackwoods since before Catherine was born, maintaining a professional distance, as was expected of all the staff. The rules were clear. Attend to the child's physical needs, but avoid emotional attachments. Maxwell Blackwood believed that coddling would only weaken his daughter further. Catherine didn't respond as Mrs. Reynolds set down the tray. She never did. "Your father will be joining you for dinner at 6, the housekeeper added, though she expected no reply. "Chef is preparing your favorite, lemon chicken." It wasn't actually Catherine's favorite. Before the accident, she had loved her mother's homemade mac and cheese, but no one remembered that now, and Catherine had stopped correcting them months. Mrs. Reynolds left with the same quiet efficiency with which she had entered, the door clicking softly behind her. Catherine remained at the window, her small world unchanged. 3 days later, the carefully maintained routine of the Blackwood estate faced its first disruption in years. Mrs. Reynolds appeared in Maxwell's study, her usual composure slightly fractured. "I apologize for the interruption, sir, but I'm afraid I must resign." Maxwell looked up from his laptop, annoyance flashing across his face. "Is there a problem with your compensation?" "No, sir. It's my sister in Chicago. Her health has taken a turn, and I need to relocate to assist with her care." Maxwell nodded curtly. "Inconvenient, but understandable. Personnel will arrange for a suitable replacement." "Actually, sir, I took the liberty of interviewing some candidates. There's one in particular I believe would be an excellent fit, Olivia Bennett. She has extensive experience in household management and comes with exceptional references." Maxwell waved his hand dismissively. "If you've vetted her, that's sufficient. Have HR finalize the paperwork." What Maxwell didn't know, what Mrs. Reynolds carefully omitted, was that Olivia Bennett's extensive experience wasn't in managing estates of the wealthy. For the past 5 years, Olivia had worked at the Lighthouse Center for the Visually Impaired in Boston, helping children navigate the challenges of a world they couldn't see. Olivia arrived at the Blackwood estate on a Monday morning in early April, the sea breeze tugging at her simple navy dress as she stood before the imposing entrance. At 32, she carried herself with quiet confidence, her warm brown eyes taking in the cold grandeur of her new workplace. "Miss Bennett, welcome to Blackwood Estate." The estate manager, Mr. Harrington, greeted her with professional courtesy. "I'll show you to your quarters and brief you on your responsibilities." As they walked through the mansion, Olivia absorbed every detail: the sterile perfection, the hushed atmosphere, the absence of family photos or personal touches. This wasn't a home, it was a showpiece. Miss Catherine's care is primarily handled by her private tutors and Dr. Patterson, Mr. Harrington explained as they passed a closed door on the second floor. "Your interaction with her will be limited to basic household matters." Olivia nodded, keeping her expression neutral despite the tightness growing in her chest. "I understand." "Mr. Blackwood expects all staff to maintain appropriate boundaries," he continued. "Miss Catherine's condition requires consistency and discipline, not emotional entanglements." The tour concluded with a detailed schedule: when meals were served, which days the various specialists visited, how the household accounts were managed. Not once did anyone mention what Catherine enjoyed, what made her smile, what dreams might still live behind those sightless eyes. That night, after the mansion had fallen silent, Olivia sat at the small desk in her quarters, reviewing the staff handbook. Between the lines of formal procedures and protocols, she read a different story, one of a broken family, frozen in grief, preserved in the amber of wealth and isolation. She thought of the children at the Lighthouse Center, how they had learned to navigate the world through sound, touch, and smell, how they had found joy despite their challenges, how the right guidance had helped them build confidence and independence. Olivia closed the handbook and made a decision that would change everything. The next morning, while performing her assigned task of organizing Catherine's bookshelf, Olivia noticed something tucked behind the untouched row of audiobooks, a small worn copy of The Secret Garden, its cover faded and spine creased from repeated readings. "This was my favorite book when I was your age," Olivia said conversationally, even though Catherine sat unresponsive by her usual spot at the window. For the first time, Catherine's head tilted slightly in Olivia's direction, a tiny movement, almost imperceptible, but Olivia caught it. The story is about a girl named Mary who discovers a hidden garden that everyone has forgotten about, Olivia continued, moving slowly toward Catherine. She brings it back to life, and in doing so, she helps heal a household full of sadness. Catherine's fingers stopped their restless movement on the windowsill. Olivia sat down on the window seat, maintaining a respectful distance. "I have a special version of this book that I think you might like. Would you be interested in that?" Catherine didn't respond, but she didn't turn away either. For Olivia, that was enough. The seed had been planted. Unknown to either of them, Maxwell. Blackwood stood in the surveillance room, watching the interaction on the monitor. His face remained impassive, but a flicker of something, unease perhaps or recognition, passed through his eyes before he turned away. That evening, a small package arrived at Olivia's quarters, a Braille version of The Secret Garden, rushed from a specialty bookstore in Boston. As she ran her fingers over the embossed cover, Olivia knew she was crossing a line that could cost her this position. But some risks were worth taking. And in the east wing of the mansion, for the first time in months, Catherine Blackwood fell, asleep, thinking not of what she had lost, but of a forgotten garden waiting to be discovered. 2 weeks passed at Blackwood Estate, with the slow inevitability of the tides against the cliffs below. For 13 days, Olivia had left the Braille, copy of The Secret Garden on Catherine's nightstand, and for 13 days it remained untouched. Each morning, Olivia would check for any sign that small fingers had explored its pages during the night. Each morning, she found none. But Olivia Bennett was nothing if not patient. At the Lighthouse Center, she had worked with a boy who didn't speak for 6 months. until one day he recited an entire poem about the ocean. Some breakthroughs couldn't be rushed. On the 14th day, as Olivia arranged fresh flowers in Catherine's room, she noticed something different. The book had moved just slightly, its position shifted by perhaps an inch from where she had left it. "Would you like me to read it with you?" Olivia asked, keeping her tone casual as she trimmed a stem. Catherine sat in her usual spot by the window, seemingly oblivious, but her fingers had stopped their restless tapping. "I could show you how the Braille works," Olivia continued. "It's like a secret code you can read with your fingertips." The silence stretched between them, but it felt different now, expectant rather than empty. Finally, Catherine turned her face toward Olivia, her unseeing eyes directed somewhere over Olivia's left shoulder. "Did you touch it?" The child's voice was so soft, so hesitant that Olivia almost missed it. "The book? Yes, I've read it many times." "No." Catherine's fingers twisted in her lap. "The Braille. Did you touch it like I would?" Olivia moved closer, careful to telegraph her movements with the sound of her footsteps. "I can read a little Braille, but I'm not as fast as someone who uses it every day. Would you like to learn together?" For one terrible moment, Olivia thought she had pushed too far, too fast. Catherine's face closed off, and she turned back toward the window. But then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. That evening, while the rest of the household staff prepared for Maxwell Blackwood's business dinner with potential investors, Olivia and Catherine sat cross-legged on the plush carpet of the child's bedroom, the Braille book open between them. "Each letter is made up of different combinations of these 6 dots, Olivia explained, guiding Catherine's small fingers over the raised patterns. "See how this one has dots in positions 1, 2, and 3? That's the letter L." Catherine frowned in concentration, her fingertips exploring with growing confidence. "What's this one?" "That's Jabu. And next to it is I. Together they spell Y. Like in winter." "Exactly. Let's find the next letters." They worked through words slowly. Window, garden, secret, each success bringing a tiny shift in Catherine's demeanor. The rigid set of her shoulders softened. The perpetual crease between her brows eased. By the time they reached the end of the first page, something miraculous had happened. Catherine Blackwood had leaned forward in anticipation. "Can we do more tomorrow?" she asked as Olivia gently closed the book. "Absolutely," Olivia promised. "Same time?" What neither of them knew was that downstairs, Maxwell Blackwood's dinner was not going as planned. His pitch to a group of conservative Boston investors had hit an unexpected snag when questions arose about the ethical implications of his latest acquisition, a pharmaceutical company with controversial testing practices. "I assure you, gentlemen, that Baker Pharmaceuticals will be restructured under our guidance," Maxwell stated, his tone brooking no argument. "The return on investment will more than justify—" "With all due respect," Blackwood interrupted. Harold Winthrop, whose family had controlled New England shipping for generations, "Some of us are concerned with more than just the bottom line. My grandson volunteers at that center for the blind in Boston, the Lighthouse Place. They rely on affordable medications for many of their programs." Maxwell's expression remained impassive, though his knuckles whitened around his water glass. "I fail to see the relevance." "The relevance is that Baker's price hikes would devastate programs like that," Winthrop countered. "You can't just look at spreadsheets. There are real people affected by these decisions." "Business and charity should remain separate endeavors," Maxwell replied coolly. "I donate generously to several foundations." The conversation moved on, but the exchange left Maxwell unsettled in a way he couldn't quite define. Later that night, as the mansion settled into silence, he found himself standing outside Catherine's door, hand raised to knock but not quite making contact. From inside came a sound so foreign to the Blackwood estate that it took him a moment to recognize it: his daughter's laughter. Maxwell lowered his hand and turned away, telling himself he would speak with her in the morning. He had urgent emails to answer, strategy to revise. The business never stopped, and sentimentality was a luxury he couldn't afford. But as he walked down the long corridor to his study, The sound of that laughter followed him, echoing in hallways that had been silent for too long. The next morning, Maxwell was called away on an emergency business trip to New York. Before leaving, he summoned Mr. Harrington to his study. "I'll be gone for 3 days," he stated, signing the documents his assistant had prepared. "While I'm away, I want detailed reports on all household activities." "Of course, sir," the estate manager nodded. "Anything specific you'd like monitored?" Maxwell hesitated, pen hovering above paper. "The new housekeeper, Bennett. Keep an eye on her interactions with Catherine." "Is there a problem, sir?" "Not necessarily, just observation." As his private helicopter lifted off from the estate's helipad, Maxwell gazed down at the sprawling mansion below. From this height, the walls that separated the rooms, that separated him from his daughter, were invisible. The estate looked whole, unbroken. It was only when you got closer that you could see the divisions. In New York, meetings blurred together in glass-walled conference rooms high above the city. Maxwell moved through them with his usual precision, his mind divided between acquisition strategies and the unexpected memory of his daughter's laughter. During a rare break between meetings, he found himself standing before a display window in the lobby of his Manhattan office building. Behind the glass stood a collection of artifacts from the Maxwell Blackwood Foundation for the Arts, his tax-efficient, charitable endeavor. Among the items was a sculpture created by a blind artist, its surfaces deliberately textured, to be experienced through touch rather than sight. A small placard beside it read, "Art exists beyond the visual. To truly understand this piece, close your eyes and let your fingers see." Maxwell stared at it for a long moment, then turned away, ignoring the curious glances of employees who had never seen the CEO linger at the display before. Back at Blackwood, estate Olivia and Catherine's lessons had progressed from single words to full sentences. They sat together in the mansion's rarely used library, where Olivia had discovered a collection of children's books in Braille, likely purchased by some well-meaning specialist and then forgotten. When Mary Lennox was sent to Misselthwaite Manor to live with her uncle, everybody said she was the most disagreeable-looking child ever seen. Catherine read slowly, her fingers moving steadily across the page. "You're doing wonderfully," Olivia encouraged. "Do you remember what disagreeable means?" Catherine nodded. "It means people didn't like her, like they don't like me." The words hit Olivia like a physical blow. "Catherine, why would you say that?" The girl shrugged, her fingers continuing to trace the Braille patterns. "I heard Dr. Patterson tell Daddy that I'm resistant to engagement. That means difficult, disagreeable." Olivia chose her next words carefully. "I think it means that Dr. Patterson hasn't found the right way to connect with you yet. Just like Mary in the story, people thought she was disagreeable because they didn't understand her." "Did you know I wasn't always blind?" Catherine asked suddenly, her hands going still on the page. "I did know that," Olivia answered softly. "Everyone treats me like I've always been this way, like I don't remember colors or faces or," her voice caught, "or what my mom looked like." In that moment, professional boundaries seemed meaningless in the face of a child's pain. Olivia reached out and gently took Catherine's hand. "Would you like to tell me about her, about what you remember?" And there, in the dusty library of a house too perfect to be a home, Catherine Blackwood began to speak. She described her mother's laugh like bells but warm ones, and the scent of her perfume, like flowers but not the ones Mrs. Reynolds puts in my room. She talked about trips to the beach before the mansion was built, how her mother would help her collect shells and arrange them by size and color. "She used to call me Little Fish because I could swim before I could run," Catherine said, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Daddy doesn't call me anything now." Olivia squeezed Catherine's hand. "Maybe he's forgotten how." "Can you teach him, like you're teaching me?" The innocent question hung in the air between them, impossibly complicated and heartbreakingly simple. Before Olivia could formulate an answer, the library door opened. Mr. Harrington stood in the doorway, his expression shifting from surprise to disapproval as he took in the scene. Olivia and Catherine sitting close together, hands linked, the Braille book open before them. "Miss Bennett, a word please?" His tone left no room for argument. As Olivia reluctantly followed him into the corridor, Catherine called after her, "We'll finish the chapter tomorrow, right?" "Right," Olivia confirmed, ignoring Mr. Harrington's deepening frown. "Same time. Tomorrow." But as the library door closed behind them, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that their borrowed time was running out. Maxwell Blackwood's helicopter touched down on the estate's helipad precisely at 7:32 p.m., cutting through the golden sunset that bathed Newport's coastline. The mansion gleamed before him, every window reflecting the dying light, beautiful, immaculate, and empty despite its massive size. "Welcome back, sir," Mr. Harrington greeted him at the entrance. "I trust your trip was successful?" "The Liu merger is proceeding," Maxwell replied, handing his briefcase to a waiting assistant. "Any developments here?" A flicker of hesitation crossed the estate manager's face. "There is a matter concerning Miss Bennett that requires your attention." Maxwell paused in the act of removing his coat. "Continue." "She's been spending considerable time with Miss Catherine, unsupervised time. They've been reading together, using Braille books from the library. And it's beyond her position's purview, sir. The specialists have been quite clear that Catherine's schedule should remain consistent and structured. Miss Bennett's interventions could undermine their methodology." Maxwell's expression remained neutral, but his mind raced with conflicting thoughts. He remembered the laughter he'd heard, the sound that had followed him to New York and back. Has Catherine shown any negative reactions to these interactions? "Well, no, sir," Mr. Harrington admitted. "Quite the opposite. She's been more responsive. But that's hardly the point. Rules exist for a reason, and Miss Bennett has—" "I'll handle it," Maxwell interrupted, already walking toward his study. "Have dinner sent up in an hour." Alone in his sanctuary of dark woods and leather, Maxwell pulled up the security footage from the past 3 days. Camera by camera, hour by hour, he watched Olivia Bennett and his daughter together, reading, talking, eventually laughing. He saw Catherine's face animated in a way it hadn't been since before the accident, her hands gesturing as she spoke, her posture relaxed instead of rigid with tension. In one sequence, they sat at the piano in the music room, Olivia guiding Catherine's fingers over the keys. The sound was muted on the security footage, but Maxwell could see his daughter's expression of wonder as she pressed a key and felt the vibration travel through her small body. "She's a natural musician, like her mother," a voice said from the doorway. Maxwell looked up to find Eleanor Blackwood, his mother, standing there in her customary black attire, diamonds glinting at her throat. At 72, she remained a formidable presence, the architect of the original Blackwood fortune and the family's uncompromising standards. "Mother, I wasn't expecting you until next week." "Clearly." Eleanor moved into the room with regal precision, her gaze falling on the security footage. "I see Catherine has a new friend." The way she said the word made it sound like a disease. "Miss Bennett is a housekeeper," Maxwell stated, closing the video feed. "Is she? Because it appears she's acting well outside that role. The child has qualified specialists for her condition. This woman is disrupting years of professional guidance." Maxwell stood, matching his mother's steely gaze. "Catherine seems responsive to her approach. Responsiveness isn't the goal, Maxwell. Strength is." Eleanor moved to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. "We discussed this after the accident. Coddling Catherine will only make her weaker. The world won't accommodate her disability. She must learn to overcome it through discipline and self-reliance. She's 10 years old, Mother. You were 8 when your father left, and I never once allowed you to use that as an excuse for weakness. Look what you've become because of it." The words hung between them, a familiar refrain, the foundation upon which Maxwell had built his life and his business. Emotion was weakness, attachment was vulnerability, success required sacrifice. "I'll speak with Miss Bennett," he conceded finally. Eleanor nodded, satisfied. "See that you do. The quarterly board meeting is in 3. Weeks. The other directors will be watching closely after the Baker acquisition hiccup. We can't afford any distractions. After his mother retired to her suite in the West Wing, Maxwell remained in his study, the conversation replaying in his mind. On his desk sat a framed photograph, the only personal item in the meticulously arranged space. It showed Elizabeth, his late wife, holding a newborn Catherine, both of them bathed in sunlight on the deck of their old summer house. Before the empire expanded, before the mansion was built, before everything changed. He reached for the intercom. "Send Miss Bennet." "To my study immediately." 10 minutes later, Olivia Bennet stood before him, her posture relaxed but confident. Maxwell studied her with a businessman's calculating eye, late 30s perhaps, simply dressed in the estate's required uniform, her eyes direct and unwavering. "Mr. Blackwood," she acknowledged with a slight nod. "You wanted to see me?" "I understand you've been spending time with my daughter outside your assigned duties." "Yes, sir. We've been reading together." No excuses, no defensive explanations. Her directness was unusual among his employees, who typically couched their responses in deferential language. "That wasn't part of your job description, Miss Bennet." "No, it wasn't," she agreed, "but it seemed necessary." Maxwell leaned back, in his chair momentarily thrown by her candor. Necessary? Catherine was isolated, withdrawn. The structured approach wasn't working for her. "And you determined this based on your extensive medical qualifications?" His tone was cutting. "Based on 5 years at the Lighthouse Center for the Visually Impaired in Boston," Olivia countered evenly. "I specialized in transitional cases, children who lost their sight rather than being born blind." Maxwell went still. This information hadn't been in her file, or if it hadn't been flagged for his attention. "You misrepresented your background to gain employment here. I presented my household management experience, which is substantial. My other qualifications weren't asked about." "A lie of omission is still a lie, Miss Bennet." "With respect, Mr. Blackwood, what exactly are you afraid of?" Olivia asked, stepping closer to his desk. "That Catherine might learn to read independently, that she might laugh occasionally, that she might remember there's a world beyond these walls?" The question struck too close to truths Maxwell had carefully avoided examining. He rose from his chair, anger masking the uncomfortable revelation. "You're dismissed. From this conversation and from your position. Pack your things. I want you gone by morning." Olivia didn't flinch. "May I say goodbye to Catherine first?" "No." It would only upset her unnecessarily. "Unnecessarily," Olivia repeated, incredulity breaking through her composed facade. "Mr. Blackwood, your daughter has made real progress. Severing this connection without explanation will undo everything she's gained." "My daughter's welfare is not your concern," Maxwell stated coldly. "She has the best specialists money can buy. What she needs can't be bought. She needs connection, compassion. She needs her father." "That's enough." Maxwell turned away, staring out at the darkened grounds. "Security will escort you to collect your belongings." He waited for the sound of the door closing, for the satisfaction of reasserting control over his household. Instead, he heard Olivia's voice, quieter now but no less determined. "You know, Catherine told me about her mother, about how Elizabeth used to call her Little Fish because she could swim before she could walk." Maxwell's shoulders stiffened. "She remembers colors, Mr. Blackwood. She remembers what the ocean looks like. But those memories are fading, and all your specialists are doing is teaching her to live without them, instead of helping her preserve what she still has." "Get out," Maxwell whispered, his voice dangerously soft. This time Olivia complied. The door closed quietly behind her, leaving Maxwell alone with the weight of her words and the oppressive silence of his perfect, empty mansion. The next morning, Catherine sat at her usual place by the window, fingers tracing patterns on the sill as she waited for Olivia to arrive for their reading session. When the door finally opened, she turned with a smile that quickly faded as she recognized the heavier footsteps of Mrs. Reynolds. "Where's Miss Bennet?" she asked, anxiety edging into her voice. "Miss Bennet is no longer employed at Blackwood Estate," Mrs. Reynolds replied, setting down Catherine's breakfast tray with practiced efficiency. Dr. Patterson will be here at 10 for your regular session. Catherine's small hands clenched into fists. No, I want Miss Bennet. We were supposed to finish our chapter today. I'm afraid that's not possible, Miss Catherine. Your father has made other arrangements. Did she leave a message? For me, a note? Mrs. Reynolds hesitated, remembering the sealed envelope Olivia had pressed into her hands that morning, the pleading look in her eyes. An envelope now locked in the housekeeper's desk drawer, following Mr. Harrington's explicit instructions that there was to be no further contact. No, Miss Catherine, nothing at all. The lie hung in the air between them, as tangible as the untouched breakfast growing cold on the tray. Catherine's face, which had shown so much animation in recent days, closed off completely. She turned back to the window, her posture a perfect mirror of her father's when he retreated behind emotional walls. You may go, she said, her voice suddenly older, colder. In the weeks that followed, Catherine reverted to her previous state of withdrawal, but with a new disturbing edge. She refused to cooperate with her tutors and specialists. She wouldn't touch the Braille books. When Dr. Patterson attempted to introduce a new therapeutic approach, she knocked the materials to the floor and sat in resolute silence until he left. The only person she would interact with at all was her grandmother, Eleanor, much to everyone's surprise. The stern matriarch had never shown particular interest in her granddaughter before, but now she spent hours in Catherine's room, speaking in low tones that the house staff couldn't overhear. Maxwell observed this development with unease. His mother reported progress in Catherine's attitude, but the security footage told a different story. His daughter's face remained expressionless during Eleanor's visits, her responses minimal. There was compliance, yes, but no engagement. Certainly nothing like the animated conversations she'd had with Olivia Bennet. One evening, a month after Olivia's dismissal, Maxwell entered Catherine's room for their weekly dinner together, a ritual that had become increasingly strained. I understand you've been spending time with grandmother, he said after several minutes of silence. Yes. Catherine pushed food around her plate without eating. Is that helpful for you? Catherine's unseeing eyes turned in his direction. Grandmother says feelings make you weak, that I need to be strong like a real Blackwood. The words, his mother's words, sounded wrong coming from his daughter's mouth. For the first time, Maxwell felt a flicker of doubt about the path they were on. Catherine, about Miss Bennet. I don't want to talk about her. Catherine pushed her plate away. May I be excused? Maxwell nodded, then remembering she couldn't see him, said, yes. As Catherine made her way carefully to the door, using the memory of the room's layout rather than her cane, Maxwell found himself wondering who was really trapped in this mansion, his daughter or himself. The Boston Public Library stood as a monument to knowledge and accessibility, its McKim building overlooking Copley Square, with the quiet authority of an institution that believed information belonged to everyone. Maxwell Blackwood felt oddly out of place as he climbed the grand staircase, more accustomed to the sleek glass towers of financial districts than the warm stone and vaulted ceilings of this public space. He had told no one where he was going, not his executive assistant, not his mother, not the estate staff. For the first time in years, Maxwell Blackwood moved through the world as an ordinary man, anonymous in a simple button-down shirt and slacks instead of his usual bespoke suits. Excuse me, he approached the reference desk. I'm looking for information about learning Braille for a child. The librarian, a woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes, smiled warmly. Of course, the Center for Adaptive Services is on the 3rd floor. They have excellent resources. For children with visual impairments, are you a parent or educator? The question caught him off guard. Was he a parent? Biologically, yes, in every way that mattered. In the daily acts of guidance, support, and love, he wasn't sure anymore. Parent, he answered after a pause that lasted too long. The librarian's smile dimmed slightly, picking up on his hesitation. The center offers family workshops too. They can be quite helpful for the whole support system. Maxwell nodded his thanks and followed her directions to the 3rd floor. The Center for Adaptive Services was a bright open space with colorful furniture and tactile displays along the walls. Children's artwork hung from the ceiling, three-dimensional creations that exploded with texture and imagination. "Can I help you find something specific?" A young man with a library badge approached. "I'm looking for resources on teaching Braille to a child who recently lost her sight." "Absolutely. We have several options depending on the child's age and learning style." The young man led him to a section of shelves filled with books, kits, and educational materials. The Beginning Braille series is excellent for younger children, while the Transitional Literacy program works well for kids who were already reading print before losing their vision. Maxwell found himself overwhelmed by the wealth of information: tactile, picture books, Braille teaching guides, adaptive technology catalogues. He had spent millions on specialists for Catherine, yet had never once visited a place like this himself, never held these materials in his own hands. "Do you have anything that explains Braille to adults? Something a parent could learn from?" The Pawnee librarian brightened. "Actually, we have a great primer designed exactly for that purpose. It teaches adults the basics so they can support their child's learning journey." As Maxwell leafed through the book, his eye caught a familiar name on a flyer pinned to a community bulletin board: Lighthouse Center for the Visually Impaired, Summer Reading Program Coordinator Olivia Bennett. His breath caught. Without thinking, he moved closer to the board, studying the flyer with its cheerful graphics and listed schedule of events. "The Lighthouse Center does amazing work," the librarian commented, noticing his interest. "They're just a few blocks from here. In fact, they're having an open house tomorrow if you're interested in learning more." Maxwell tucked the information away, along with the Braille primer and several other resources the librarian recommended. As he was checking out, a small display near the exit caught his attention: a collection of books about siblings of children with disabilities. One title in particular stopped him cold: The Forgotten Ones, Growing Up in the Shadow of a Sibling's Special Needs. A long-buried memory surfaced: a small boy with cloudy eyes and hesitant steps, relegated to a separate wing of the Blackwood family's old house. A brother, 7 years younger than Maxwell, whom no one spoke about, Jason. The shock of this recollection was physical, like a blow to the chest. Maxwell couldn't remember the last time he had thought of Jason. After his father left and Eleanor took control of the family business and fortune, Jason had been sent away to a special school. Eventually, the family stopped mentioning him altogether. It was as if he had never existed. And Maxwell, desperate for his mother's approval, had accepted this erasure without question. Now, standing in a library surrounded by resources for families embracing their children's differences rather than hiding them away, the magnitude of this family secret crashed over him. Had his treatment of Catherine, the isolation, the reliance on specialists rather than personal connection, been unwittingly modeled after his mother's approach to Jason? The question followed him back to Newport, haunting him through the silent corridors of Blackwood Estate. That night, unable to sleep, Maxwell found himself outside Catherine's room, listening to the sound of her restless movement. The door was ajar, unusual as Catherine typically insisted on privacy. He peered inside to find his daughter sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by scattered papers. In the dim light from her bedside lamp, he could see she was running her fingers over them repeatedly, her frustration evident in the tightness of her shoulders. "Catherine," he said softly. She startled, quickly gathering the papers. "I'm fine. Just couldn't sleep." Maxwell stepped into the room, careful to make his footsteps audible so she could track his movement. "What are you working on?" For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, with reluctant honesty, she admitted, "I'm trying to practice my Braille, but I can't remember all the patterns Miss Bennett taught me." The mention of Olivia Bennett hung between them, the first time either had spoken her name since her dismissal. "May I?" Maxwell asked, gesturing to the papers before remembering she couldn't see the gesture. "May I sit with you?" Catherine nodded, her wariness evident even in that small movement. Maxwell lowered himself to the floor beside her, acutely aware of how unfamiliar this closeness felt. Had it always been this way? Had he ever sat beside her like this even before the accident? "I bought some books today," he said, pulling the Braille primer from his briefcase, "about learning Braille. Perhaps we could figure it out together." Catherine's face registered shock, then suspicion. "Grandmother says I should focus on my other senses, that reading is a distraction." "Your grandmother isn't always right," Maxwell said, the words feeling like rebellion. I think Miss Bennet had the right idea. Reading is freedom, independence." "You fired her," Catherine said flatly. "I did," Maxwell acknowledged, "and that was a mistake." The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and momentous. "So find her," Catherine challenged, her small face turned up toward his voice. "Bring her back." "It's not that simple." "It is," Catherine insisted with unexpected fierceness. "You're Maxwell Blackwood. Everyone says you can do anything." The child's faith in his omnipotence would have been amusing if it weren't so heartbreaking. In Catherine's world, her father was all-powerful, capable of taking away the people she cared about and, presumably, bringing them back just as easily. "I'll try," he promised, meaning it for perhaps the first time in their conversations. "But in the meantime, shall we learn together?" Catherine hesitated, then nodded. "Page 1 has the alphabet. A is .1. They worked for hours, until Catherine finally fell asleep on the floor beside the scattered Braille sheets. Maxwell carried her to bed. When had she gotten so light? Had she always been this fragile in his arms? And stood watching her sleep, overwhelmed by how much he had missed, how much time he had wasted. The next morning, Maxwell Blackwood did something unprecedented. He cleared his schedule for the entire day. Over breakfast, he told Catherine he was taking her on a special outing. "Where are we going?" she asked, suspicion still edging her voice. "Boston. There's a place called the Lighthouse Center." Maxwell watched her expression carefully. "I thought we might visit their summer reading program." Catherine went very still. "Will Miss Bennet be there?" "I don't know," Maxwell answered honestly, "but I'd like to find out." The journey to Boston in Maxwell's private helicopter was tense with anticipation. Catherine sat rigid beside him, her small hands clutching a Braille book they had practiced with the night before. Maxwell found himself uncharacteristically nervous. What if Olivia Bennet refused to see them? What if she had moved on, taken a different position? What if she looked at him with the same cold dismissal he had shown her? The Lighthouse Center occupied a renovated brownstone in Boston's Back Bay, its entrance marked by a cheerful sign with raised lettering and Braille beneath. As Maxwell guided Catherine up the steps, he could hear children's voices and laughter from inside, sounds that rarely echoed through Blackwood Estate. The receptionist looked up as they entered, her expression shifting from professional welcome to recognition. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, unable to hide her surprise. "And this must be Catherine. We've heard so much about you from Miss Bennet." Catherine's face lit up. "She's here? Can I see her?" "She's leading the summer reading group right now," the receptionist explained, glancing uncertainly at Maxwell. "In the garden courtyard." "May we observe?" Maxwell asked. The receptionist hesitated, then nodded. "This way, please." She led them through a colorful hallway lined with tactile artwork to a glass door opening onto a small courtyard. There, beneath a shade tree, sat Olivia Bennet, surrounded by a semicircle of children ranging from about 5 to 12 years old. Each child held a Braille book, and Olivia was moving from one to another, offering guidance and encouragement. Maxwell and Catherine stood in the doorway, unnoticed. For several minutes, they simply watched Olivia work, her patience, her gentle humor, the way she celebrated each small success. It was so different from the clinical approach of Catherine's specialists, who measured progress in detached metrics rather than smiles and laughter. Then Olivia looked up, her eyes meeting Maxwell's across the courtyard. Her expression froze, a complex mix of emotions crossing her face. "Miss Bennet!" Catherine called out, recognizing her voice as she spoke to one of the children. The courtyard fell silent as all heads turned toward the newcomers. Olivia rose slowly, smoothing her skirt with hands that weren't quite steady. "Catherine," she said, her voice warm despite her obvious shock. "What a wonderful surprise." She approached them, her gaze shifting between Catherine and Maxwell with undisguised wariness. Mr. Blackwood, this is unexpected. May we speak privately? Maxwell asked, aware of the curious stares from the children and staff. Olivia nodded. Tim can take over for a few minutes, she said to her assistant. Catherine, would you like to join the reading circle while your father and I talk? Catherine hesitated, one hand still clutching Maxwell's sleeve. You'll come back, right, Daddy? The simple question, weighted with the history of abandonment she had experienced, struck Maxwell to the core. Of course, little fish, he said, the old nickname slipping out before he realized it. I promise. As Tim led Catherine to the circle, introducing her to the other children, Maxwell followed Olivia to a small office off the main corridor. The space was cluttered but warm. Children's artwork on the walls, books stacked on every surface, a desk covered in grant applications and curriculum plans. Please sit, Olivia offered, clearing a stack of papers from a chair. Maxwell remained standing. I owe you an apology. Olivia Bennett had imagined this moment many times in the weeks since her dismissal from Blackwood Estate. The powerful Maxwell Blackwood seeking her out, perhaps to threaten legal action for her interference, perhaps to offer money for her silence. What she hadn't imagined was him standing in her cluttered office, his customary arrogance replaced by something that looked remarkably like humility. I owe you an apology, he repeated, when she didn't respond immediately. My treatment of you was inexcusable. Olivia studied him carefully. The man before her looked different from the impeccable figure who had dismissed her from his study. His expensive clothes were slightly rumpled, there was stubble on his jaw, and the dark circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights. I don't need an apology, Mr. Blackwood, she said finally. What I need to know is why you're here. Catherine misses you, he answered. Then with uncharacteristic honesty added, and I believe I was wrong. About many things. Olivia gestured to the chair again, and this time Maxwell sat, perching, uncomfortably on the edge as if uncertain of his welcome. Since you left, Catherine has regressed, he continued. She won't work with her specialists. She barely speaks. Until last night, I hadn't heard her laugh since the day you were dismissed. That doesn't surprise me, Olivia said, keeping her tone neutral despite the ache in her heart for Catherine. She was beginning to trust again, and then that trust was broken. Children who have experienced trauma are especially vulnerable to that kind of disruption. I want to fix it, Maxwell said, leaning forward. I want to help her the way you were helping her. Why now? What's changed? The question hung between them, demanding more than a superficial answer. For a moment, Olivia thought he wouldn't respond, that the wall of Blackwood Reserve would slam back into place. Instead, Maxwell did something she would never have. Expected, he told the truth. I remembered something I've spent most of my life trying to forget, he said, his voice dropping so low she had to lean forward to hear him. My brother. I didn't know you had a brother. No one does anymore. His name was Jason. He was born blind. Maxwell's gaze fixed on some point beyond her, beyond the present. My mother believed his disability reflected poorly on the family. When my father left and she took control, Jason was sent away to a special school. Eventually, he was erased from our family narrative entirely. Olivia felt a chill at the clinical way he described such a profound act of rejection, even as she recognized the pain beneath the dispassionate recounting. What happened to him, she asked gently. Maxwell's composure faltered for the first time. I don't know. I was 10 when he was sent away. By the time I was old enough to question it, the subject was forbidden. Last night I realized I've been allowing my mother to do to Catherine what she did to Jason, isolating her, treating her difference as something to be hidden rather than embraced. The revelation hung between them, raw and honest, in a way Olivia hadn't thought Maxwell Blackwood capable of. Mr. Blackwood. Maxwell, he corrected. Please. Maxwell, she amended. What exactly are you asking of me? Come back to Blackwood Estate, not as a housekeeper, but as Catherine's teacher. Help her. Help me learn how to be the father she deserves. The offer was tempting, more than tempting. In the weeks since her dismissal, Olivia had worried constantly about Catherine, the bright, resilient child trapped in that cold, perfect mansion. "It's not that simple," she said. "The environment at Blackwood Estate isn't conducive to the kind of work Catherine needs. The isolation, the rigid structure, your mother's influence." "I'm prepared to make changes," Maxwell interrupted. "Significant ones. Such as moving, selling the estate, finding a home that's actually a home, not a monument." Olivia couldn't hide her surprise. "That's drastic." "It's necessary," Maxwell insisted. "I've been blind too. Blind to what Catherine truly needs. Blind to my own part in her isolation. I don't want to repeat my mother's mistakes." The conviction in his voice was compelling, but Olivia had worked with too many families to take sudden transformations at face. "Fleopi, these kinds of changes don't happen overnight," she cautioned. "It's a process that requires consistent effort, not just a momentary epiphany." "I understand I'm not asking you to believe me based on words alone." Maxwell reached into his pocket and withdrew a business card, sliding it across the desk to her. "This is our family attorney. I've already instructed him to begin drafting papers to establish a foundation for visually impaired children. I'd like you to be a part of shaping its mission." Olivia picked up the card, turning it over in her fingers as she considered his proposition. "And your mother. Eleanor Blackwood isn't known for relinquishing control easily." A shadow crossed Maxwell's face. "My mother and I will be having a long overdue conversation. The outcome of that conversation will determine many things, but not this. Not Catherine's well-being. Not anymore." Before Olivia could respond, a commotion at the door drew their attention. Catherine stood there, flanked by Tim, her face alight with excitement. "Daddy!" "Miss Bennett, I read a whole page by myself. A real Braille book, not just practice sheets." The pride in her voice was impossible to resist. Olivia moved to congratulate her, but Maxwell got there first, kneeling down to Catherine's level, a gesture Olivia had never seen him make before. "That's wonderful, little fish," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Will you read it to me later?" Catherine nodded eagerly, then reached out hesitantly until her fingers found his face. She traced his features lightly, an intimacy Olivia had never witnessed between them. "You sound different," Catherine said, her head tilted curiously. "Happy. I am happy," Maxwell confirmed, catching her small hand and pressing it to his cheek. "And I hope you will be too when you hear what I'm about to suggest." As Catherine listened to her father outline their potential new living arrangement and Olivia's role in it, her expression transformed from cautious hope to outright joy. "Really? We could live in Boston, near the Lighthouse Center, and Miss Bennett would teach me every day?" "If she agrees," Maxwell said, looking up at Olivia with a question in his eyes. In that moment, seeing the connection between father and daughter, fragile but real, Olivia made her decision. "I think we could arrange something," she said carefully, "on a trial basis." Catherine's whoop of delight echoed through the office, drawing smiles from passing staff members. For a child who had been so withdrawn for so long, the unbridled enthusiasm was a miracle in itself. Later that afternoon, as Maxwell took Catherine on a tour of the Lighthouse Center's facilities, Olivia pulled him aside. "Before I commit to anything, there's something I need to know," she said. "Your brother, Jason, will you try to find him?" The question clearly caught Maxwell off guard. I wouldn't know where to begin. It's been almost 30 years. But if it were possible, if I could help you track him down." Maxwell stared at her for a long moment, vulnerability and fear warring in his expression. "Why would you do that?" "Because Catherine deserves to know her family." "All of her family," Olivia said simply, "and because finding Jason might help you heal too." The drive back to Newport that evening was markedly different from their journey to Boston. Catherine chatted excitedly about the Lighthouse Center, the children she had met, the books she would read next. Maxwell listened with an attentiveness Olivia had never observed in him before, asking questions, offering encouragement. As they approached the imposing gates of Blackwood Estate, however, Catherine fell silent, her earlier joy dimming. "What's wrong, little fish?" Maxwell asked, noticing the change immediately. "Grandmother won't like this plan," Catherine said, her voice small. "She says I need to learn to be a proper Blackwood. That means being strong and not needing help. Maxwell exchanged a glance. With Olivia in the rearview mirror, "Your grandmother has her own ideas about strength," he said carefully. "But I'm learning that true strength sometimes means asking for help, even accepting it." The gate swung open automatically as the car approached, and Maxwell steeled himself for the confrontation he knew awaited him. Eleanor Blackwood stood on the mansion steps, her elegant figure rigid with disapproval. "I see you've brought company," she observed coldly as they exited the car. "How unexpected." "Mother, we need to talk," Maxwell said, placing a protective hand on Catherine's shoulder. "Privately." Eleanor's gaze swept over Olivia with dismissive assessment. "I'm sure Miss Bennet can entertain Catherine while we discuss this situation." As Olivia led Catherine toward the gardens, promising to show her how to identify flowers by scent and texture, she heard Maxwell's voice carried on the evening breeze. "Things are going to change, Mother. Beginning now." The confrontation between Maxwell and Eleanor Blackwood lasted well into the night. From Catherine's bedroom, where Olivia had established a makeshift Braille lesson using materials from the Boston Library, they could occasionally hear raised voices echoing through the mansion's cavernous halls. "Is Daddy in trouble?" Catherine asked, her fingers pausing on the Braille text. "No, sweetheart," Olivia assured her. "Sometimes adults have difficult conversations when important changes are happening. Your father is very brave to stand up for what he believes is right for you." Catherine considered this, her expression thoughtful beyond her years. "Grandmother says Blackwoods never back down. Maybe that's why they're both so loud." Olivia couldn't help but laugh. "Maybe you're right." It was past midnight when the door to Catherine's bedroom opened softly. Maxwell stood there, looking exhausted but resolute. "Is everything okay?" Olivia asked quietly, nodding toward Catherine, who had finally fallen asleep. "It will be," Maxwell said. "My mother is adjusting to the new reality. She's returning to New York tomorrow. I've made it clear that Catherine's well-being is non-negotiable." "And the foundation? The move to Boston?" "Proceeding as discussed." Maxwell moved into the room, his gaze lingering on his sleeping daughter. "Thank you, Olivia, for giving us both a second chance." In the months that followed, Blackwood Estate was sold to a hotel developer, with the proceeds split between the newly established Blackwood Foundation for Visually Impaired Children and a trust for Catherine. Maxwell and Catherine moved into a brownstone in Boston's Back Bay, just blocks from the Lighthouse Center, where Olivia continued to work part-time while serving as Catherine's private teacher. The transition wasn't always smooth. There were days when Maxwell fell back into old patterns of emotional distance, when the demands of restructuring his business interests from Boston instead of Newport threatened to consume him. There were nights when Catherine woke crying from nightmares about being left alone in the dark. But there were also breakthroughs that made the difficult days worthwhile. Catherine mastering a challenging Braille text, Maxwell learning to navigate the city with his daughter by his side rather than separated by the barrier of professional caretakers, the growing ease between them as they created new family traditions. On a crisp fall afternoon, 6 months after their move to Boston, Olivia arrived at the brownstone for Catherine's lesson, to find Maxwell sitting at the kitchen table, a manila envelope open before him. "What's this?" she asked, recognizing the letterhead of the private investigator they had hired to search for Jason Blackwood. "They found him," Maxwell said, his voice unsteady. "He's alive, living in Oregon. He's a piano tuner of all things, married with 2 children, both sighted." Olivia sat beside him, giving him time to process the information. "Are you going?" "To contact him." Maxwell stared at the photograph included in the report, a middle-aged man with a strong resemblance to himself, standing outside a modest home with a smiling woman and 2 teenage children. "I'm terrified," he admitted. "What if he hates me? I never tried to find him. I let him disappear." "You were a child," Olivia reminded him gently, "and now you have the chance to make it right." From the doorway came Catherine's voice, steady and wise beyond her years. "Daddy always says Blackwoods face their challenges head-on." They both turned to find her standing there, a Braille letter clutched in her hand. "I wrote to Uncle Jason already," she announced. "I hope that's okay." Maxwell stared at his daughter in astonishment. "You what?" "I asked Miss Olivia to help me," Catherine explained. "I told him about us moving to Boston and learning Braille and how you're different now. I told him I'd like to meet my cousins someday." She paused, suddenly uncertain. "Are you mad?" Maxwell crossed the room in 3 strides, kneeling before his daughter and gathering her small hands in his. "No, little fish, I'm not mad. I'm proud of you for being braver than I was." 2 weeks later, the phone call they had been both hoping for and dreading finally came. Jason Blackwood, speaking directly to his brother for the first time in nearly 30 years. The conversation was tentative at first, decades of silence creating a gulf between them. But as they spoke, about their lives, about Catherine, about the foundation Maxwell was establishing, the connection strengthened. By the time they hung up, plans had been made for a visit at Thanksgiving. "He doesn't hate me," Maxwell said wonderingly as he set down the phone. "After everything our mother did, after all the years of silence, he's willing to give us, another chance." Olivia, who had been helping Catherine with a science project in the next room, smiled at the shocked gratitude in his voice. "Family is more resilient than we sometimes give it credit for," she observed. "When there's love beneath the pain, reconciliation is always possible." Maxwell looked at her, really looked at her, with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You've taught me so much," he said softly, "about Catherine, about being a father, about myself." In the doorway, Catherine cleared her throat dramatically. "Are you two going to kiss now? Because Tommy at school says that's what happens in stories, when people look at each other the way you two do." Olivia felt heat rise to her cheeks, while Maxwell let out a startled laugh. "Catherine Blackwood, have you been eavesdropping?" "It's not eavesdropping," Catherine protested with the logic of a 10-year-old. "It's using my other senses to compensate for my visual impairment. Dr. Chen at the Lighthouse Center says that's a positive adaptive behavior." "Oh, really?" Maxwell raised an eyebrow. "And what does Dr. Chen say about matchmaking?" "That I should mind my own business," Catherine admitted with a grin. "But Miss Olivia isn't just my teacher anymore. She's family. Don't you think so, Daddy?" Maxwell's gaze met Olivia's, warm with possibility. "I think," he said carefully, "that we're still figuring out exactly what kind of family we're building. But yes, Olivia is definitely a part of it." As Catherine launched into an enthusiastic description of what their family Christmas card should look like, with Braille so Uncle Jason can feel our names too, Olivia felt something settle in her heart. This unconventional family, born not of obligation but of choice, was still evolving, still healing. But the foundation was strong now, built on understanding, respect, and love. 1 month later, as the first snow of winter drifted past the brownstones' windows, Maxwell presented Olivia with a small card, its surface covered in carefully embossed Braille dots. "Catherine helped me," he explained, as Olivia ran her fingers over the surface. "I wanted to make sure I got it right." Olivia translated the Braille slowly, her heart racing as the message became clear. "Some questions can only be asked in a language born of touch. Will you help us build this family together?" When she looked up, Maxwell was holding a small velvet box, his expression a mixture of hope and vulnerability that would have been unimaginable a year ago. "We've done this all backwards," he said, with a self-deprecating smile. "Most people fall in love first, then build a life together. We've already started building something wonderful. But I need you to know that somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you too." Outside the study door, Catherine waited breathlessly, her ear pressed against the wood. When she heard Olivia's tearful "yes," she burst into the room, her face alight with joy. "Did she say yes? Are we going to be a real family?" Maxwell gathered his daughter in one arm while reaching for Olivia with the other. "We already are a real family, little fish. This just makes it official." As the 3 of them stood embracing in the warm light of the study, so different from the cold perfection of Blackwood Estate, Maxwell Blackwood reflected on the journey that had brought them here. He had spent most of his life believing that true strength meant standing alone, that vulnerability was weakness, that emotions were liabilities. Now he understood that the greatest strength came from connection, from allowing yourself to need others and to be needed in return, from seeing with your heart what the eyes might miss, from learning that love in all its messy, imperfect glory was the one investment that always yielded the greatest returns. Fimda Historia. Dear readers, we hope you've been touched by Maxwell and Catherine's journey from isolation to connection. For more heartwarming stories that explore the depths of family bonds and personal transformation, check out our specially curated playlist by clicking the link to your left. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day we bring you unique narratives that delve into life's complexities and celebrate the power of human connection. Don't miss our upcoming content, and we look forward to reading your thoughts in the comments section below.